History and Biography is sponsored by Wells Fargo.
Welcome, everyone. We're here with Madeleine Albright, the 64th Secretary of State, and we're here to talk about her new book, Madeleine Albright, Hell and Other Destinations, which is a very interesting book. I've just finished reading it, and I look forward to having a conversation with Madeleine Albright about it. Madeleine, welcome to our broadcast today.
It's great to be with you, David. I enjoy talking with you anytime.
So I am at the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress. Madeleine is in her home in Washington area. I should disclose that we've had a long-standing relationship because Madeleine and I were young staffers together in the White House under President Carter, and I've followed her incredible career ever since then with great admiration. So Madeleine, this is your seventh book since you left as Secretary of State. So did you ever imagine when you finished as Secretary of State, the first woman to ever serve as Secretary of State, that you would write 7 books in addition to the other things we're going to talk about that you've done since you left as Secretary of State?
No, it never occurred to me that I would write so many, but I did think that it was important for people who had served in office to write their memoirs, because that is the basis of people really understanding what happened. And everybody writes a somewhat different version of what they saw, and it's up to researchers to figure out what really happened. So I had planned always to write a memoir.
Well, I see behind you in your home, you have a lot of books, so you're obviously a big reader and obviously a writer as well. But the most obligatory thing that people do when they leave as Secretary of State is to write the memoirs of their time as Secretary of State. And you wrote that book called Madam Secretary. How long did it take you to write that? And was it difficult to bring back all the memories? And did you enjoy writing it? And did you say afterwards it was over, one's enough?
Well, I have to tell you, it took quite a while, because it really was something that I had to figure out based on the calendar, what I had done, and to really look at it. And the thing that happened is, I think you'll remember this, in many ways during the Clinton administration, we really didn't take an awful lot of notes. And so I had these scratchy pads of things. And I finally, when I saw my schedules, it was like the Rosetta Stone, and I could figure out what it is that I had done. But I did think it was important to write it. I have to tell you, without showing off, I had met Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he said to me, when you write your memoirs, don't be angry. And I thought that that was very, very good advice. It's not the time to kind of take out whatever problems you had with somebody. But I do think that it's important to do it. It did not occur to me that I would write so many other books, but there always was a reason to write them. Because I needed to kind of elaborate on that memoir, the Madam Secretary. And so then I wrote a book about my childhood Prague winter, which was very much also part of a memoir. And then this last book, to some extent, is my post-public service memoir. So I have written quite a few. And by the way, to be totally honest, I obviously have help. Bill Woodward, who worked with me when I was in the government, and we worked together. And it's important to get the notes right and to really know what you're talking about and to recollect as best you can.
Well, one of the books you've written about as well is your pins. I see you're wearing one today. You're pretty famous for the pins. What was the genesis of wearing pins, and why did you write a book about that?
Well, let me just say, I clearly like jewelry. And what happened was, when I got to the United Nations in February '93, it was right after the Gulf War, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was an instructed ambassador, and my instructions were to make sure that the sanctions stayed on. So I said something awful about Saddam Hussein practically every day. He deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. And all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. So I started wearing a snake pin when we talked about Iraq. And the press picked it up. As you know, the ambassadors go out and there's a press huddle, and one of the reporters said, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" So I went through the fact that I had been compared to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. And so I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to reflect what I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons, and a bad day, a lot of carnivorous animals and spiders. And the other ambassadors would say to me, "What are we going to do today?" And I said, "Read my pins." And that's how it started. And the reason that I thought it was worth writing a book about it and then having a traveling collection is that I always try to make foreign policy less foreign. And all the pins that are in that collection and in the book have some kind of a foreign policy story. And I explain it. And so that's the reason. And by the way, the State Department has just opened a new diplomacy museum, and I'm giving the whole collection to them.
Wow, well, that's generous. Let me bring everybody up to speed who may not have followed your career. You worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Muskie. That was your first job as a professional, you might say, out of the house after your children were raised.
Yeah.
And then after that, you went to work in the White House, where I met you. You were working for Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been a professor of yours when you got your PhD at Columbia after graduating from Wellesley before that. And then you ultimately started advising other candidates, but you were not really advising Bill Clinton that closely, but you ultimately were picked to be his UN ambassador. Is that correct? In the first 4 years you served as his ambassador. Is that right?
Yes, and it was, and it's interesting. I had worked in a lot of presidential campaigns, but not in the Clinton one, because I was heading a 501c3 think tank. And besides, he had a lot of advisors, but I had met him first when I was working for Michael Dukakis, and Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, and he came up to brief or prepare Dukakis for the debate. And then we kind of had dinner and talked, and he had gone to Georgetown, and I was teaching at Georgetown in the 80s, and that was our connection.
So you became the UN ambassador for 4 years, and that's where the pins started. And then when the second term came along, Warren Christopher, who had been Secretary of State in the first 4 years, announced his retirement. There was some competition who was going to be the next Secretary of State. And no woman had ever been picked as Secretary of State. Did you think President Clinton was going to pick a woman to be Secretary of State?
No, I really didn't think it was going to happen. I mean, there was this period that I call of the great mentioning. And my name was mentioned because I was a cabinet member, and I'd actually been doing a lot of TV and stuff. And then somebody said, well, no woman can ever be Secretary of State because Arab leaders won't deal with a woman. And so the Arab ambassadors at the UN kind of got together and said, we've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problems dealing with Secretary Albright. And then what happened, somebody at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. And so I truly did not believe that it would happen. And I was surprised when it did happen. There's a whole story that goes with it. I was up at in New York, and Erskine Bowles, who was chief of staff, called me in December, and he said, in 92, and said, if the president of the 96, if the president of the United States were to call you, would you take the call? If the president of the United States were to ask you to be Secretary of State, would you say yes? And so I obviously said yes to both things. And Erskine said, go home, the president will call you in the morning. And I won't go through all of it, but it took a long time for the phone call, and I was sure he had changed his mind. And I really did not believe it would happen.
So it did happen. And when you served as Secretary of State, before we get into the subject of this new book, what would you say is the greatest accomplishment that you're proud of having done the job as Secretary of State, other than being the first woman of being Secretary of State?
Well, I was so thrilled to be able to represent the United States, first at the UN and then as secretary at a really fascinating time. By the way, I was the last Secretary of State of the 20th century and the first of the 21st. The only problem is I started kind of saying that several months after I was named, presumptuously, that the president would keep me the 4 years, and he did, and so I am. But I think it was a fascinating time in terms of what had happened in the post-Cold War period, and what the role of the United States was going to be. And my background is so crazy, and the history part is important. My father had been ambassador in Yugoslavia, the Czechoslovak ambassador. I actually understood the Balkans, and I understand the language. And so I do think that the thing I'm proudest of that I did was to help to end the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And it's 20 years now that this happened. And I think that it's something that I'm really proud of.
So the election is held. George W. Bush is elected president, and you are stepping down as Secretary of State. You're succeeded by Colin Powell. What advice did you give him about the job of Secretary of State?
Well, let me tell you, Colin Powell and I knew each other very well. He had actually been chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the first part of the Clinton administration, and we had had some discussions about the use of force, and we had known each other very well. And he's named secretaries of, and by the way, it was a strange period because it took so long to count the votes. And so I have always believed that the transition is a very important period. And so Colin and I had quite a few conversations about that. I did leave a note for him when I left the office in his desk saying that we had tried to clean up and make sure that it was neat, but that basically he was about to take the best job in the world. And so we talked about what it was like to be Secretary of State. And we specifically talked about something we were in the middle of, which I had just come from North Korea, talking to Kim Jong-il, the father of the current guy, about the importance of trying to resolve that problem. Colin was really going to work on that. And then what happened, frankly, is that there was a headline in the Post saying Powell to continue Clinton policies on North Korea. He was hauled into the Oval Office and told no way. But Colin and I spent a lot of time together. And I think that one of the important aspects is for current secretaries of state to deal with their predecessors. And because it's a job that is one that one can be very, very proud of, and having a contact with one's predecessors is important.
So when you leave as Secretary of State, do you get Secret Service protection for another year or so? Do you get people to drive you around? What was it like the first week after you left as Secretary of State?
Well, there had been some decision that I was going to have the diplomatic security. And then Colin calls me and says, well, there really aren't threats, so we're taking it away. So and it's really strange because I've lived in Washington a long time. I certainly knew how to drive around Washington, but I hadn't driven in 8 years. So they had to take me to the counterterrorism driving course. And then it's very strange, having been surrounded by a group of people for such a long time, to all of a sudden you really kind of feel naked going out. The people that were very nice to me during that period were actually cab drivers who would yell out the window, "Thank you for having helped our country." But it was really, really strange after the protection. And they had all lived in my garage and they were around. They were very nice people, and I got to be good friends with them.
So when you're a former Secretary of State, do people laugh at your jokes as much, or people pay as much homage, or did you find it was much different the way people treated you after you left as Secretary of State?
Very different, for sure. But I have so many funny stories about things that happen. I have a couple of them in the book. If I might tell one, is I was at Heathrow Airport, which I think you probably know is one of the more difficult ones to get through. And all of a sudden I'm picked on in order to be the person that has to take everything out of the suitcase. So I'm there on the floor taking everything out. And I finally had it. And I said to the guy, "Excuse me, but do you know who I am?" And he said, "No, but we can find a doctor that can help you figure it out." And it was really hard not to laugh at that. So, and I rarely go around saying I'm the former Secretary of State, but I couldn't resist doing that at that moment.
So one of the things you did is you started a consulting firm that's now a very, very large, well-known consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Had you had any experience as a private sector consultant before, and did you get nervous about starting that business?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the questions was, what was I going to do when I left office? Because I had this kind of mantra that whatever I was doing next had to be more interesting than what I just finished. hard to do if you've been Secretary of State. So there were questions about, I'd been asked to go back to Georgetown to teach, and I was going to give speeches, and I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. And then somebody suggested about starting a business. And I'll tell you what really happened. And it was based on things that I learned while I was secretary. So what happened when I was secretary, John Chambers from Cisco asked me to come out to Silicon Valley to talk to the techies about how the government could help them. And they said, well, the government can't help us. And I said, excuse me, you need the government to get market access and regulations. And then the opposite happened. I'd been in China and I spoke to the American Chamber, huge audiences, and I learned nothing. And so I then asked to meet with the representatives of our corporations in China, and they had a very different view of the kinds of things that were going on from some of the diplomats. And so then I came back to the department and I established a prize for American corporations that were good local citizens. And I got fascinated by the whole system of public-private partnerships. And so that's basically what our consulting firm is based on. We work abroad. We don't lobby or work in the United States, but basically trying to help corporations sort out what is happening abroad. But it's something that came from my experience as secretary, understanding the public-private partnerships. And when President Obama, for instance, spoke in Cairo about having a different relationships with Muslim majority countries, Secretary Clinton wanted to expand on it and wanted to do something commercially, this Partners for a New Beginning with Muslim majority countries, and she asked me to do that. So I have been fascinated by the public-private partnership aspect of what can and should be done.
So you're still the chair and leading the firm. It's called Albright Stonebridge. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
All right. Now, you also mentioned you're heading NDI, National Democratic Institute. What is that?
Well, it's something, by the way, that was actually begun by Ronald Reagan. He spoke in the early 80s in London at Parliament and said that democracies were not real good about explaining themselves vis-a communism. So he came back to the United States and he started the Endowment for Democracy, which has 4 institutes: business and labor, Democrats and Republicans. And so I was made the first vice chair of the National Democratic Institute. And it is now, I had worked on it before I went into the government. And it helps in terms of promoting democracy. You can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. And we are now in 70 countries. And one of the issues that's always out there is what comes first, political development or economic development? And they clearly go together because democracy has to deliver. And so because people want to vote and eat. And so I've been very interested in the kinds of things that NDI is doing now. We're in 70 countries. And we are working in a time when, as you know, democracy is under threat in a lot of different places.
So one of the things that you've also done is an institute has been set up at your alma mater, Wellesley College. And how did you happen to go to Wellesley? You were growing up in Denver after you came to the United States. How did you happen to pick Wellesley as a place to go to school?
Well, what happened was when we came to the United States, we lived on Long Island. My father was a diplomat who defected. And at that stage, the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs for people in Central European intellectuals. And they found him a job at the University of Denver. We had no idea where Denver was. Anyway, we moved to Denver and I went to a private school there on scholarship, where there were 2 teachers that had gone to Wellesley. And they talked about Wellesley an awful lot. And at one point, when I was in Cambridge in Massachusetts, I went to see the campus and thought it was fantastic. It never occurred to me that I really would be able to go there. I went to college on scholarship, and they gave me a wonderful scholarship. And I think one of the most important things that I ever did was to go to Wellesley. It has been the basis of the kinds of things that I learned and friendships, and I'm dedicated to that college in many ways. And by the way, Hillary also went to Wellesley. She's 10 years younger than I am. So we try to do things together.
And the Institute, what does the Institute do?
Well, the Institute is in order to train young women in global leadership. And what we do always is between semesters in January is, this is under normal times, the campus is empty, and we bring back 40 Albright Fellows that have been chosen, mostly juniors and seniors, in order to do projects together. They live on campus together. They get to know each other. And the part that I like about it is it's multidisciplinary. They are chosen on the basis of their majors. So there are poli-sci and econ majors, but also science majors and religion majors and literature majors. And they work together on projects. And then they have internships and come back to Wellesley and describe what they learned out of it. And there's now a cohort. We're 10 years old. So there are about 400 Albright Fellows out there.
Right.
And they women are not as good at networking as men are. So they have all met, they mentor each other, they work together. And I'm very, very proud of it. So this year's a little complicated. And I was just talking to the organizers, and we are going to do the whole thing virtually. And I try to get speakers to come and have great discussions. I'm very, very proud of the Albright Institute.
Now, you also are very active on the speaking circuit. And what was that like when you first had a speaking agent and they started sending you here and there? Did you enjoy that, or did you say it wasn't really as attractive as you thought it was going to be?
Well, at first I thought, well, this could be interesting since I really know how to talk. But they all of a sudden showed me, what really happened. And again, Colin Powell is one of the best speakers in terms of motivating people for leadership. And they sent me a tape and I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to do this. But it's very interesting. I've actually enjoyed it because I meet a lot of different people. And what I like most of all is not so much giving the speeches, but answering questions. I learn an awful lot by the kind of questions people ask, and being in different places. So I have enjoyed it. And I think that it's something that it's interesting how many kind of groups are created by people that become a part of some kind of lecture series. So I have enjoyed it.
Now, you also make a lot of commencement speeches. Those are for free and so forth. Some people charge for commencement speeches, but you obviously do not. But sometimes I read from your book that you do 3 a year. So what's the trick to keeping people interested at a commencement when they mostly want to celebrate?
Well, I have to tell you why I like it, if I might first. It took me a very long time to get my PhD. And so once I'd gotten it, I wanted to go buy my robes. And my husband said, why would you want to do? Where are you going to wear them? And I said, I don't care where I wear them. I earn them, even if I have to wear them to the supermarket. Anyway, I also, since my father was also a professor, I loved the whole academic rituals. And so I was very happy to be invited to come and speak at commencements. And so I do like doing it. I like meeting with the young people. And I try, they're all the standard jokes, but I do try to have a sense of humor. And then I really do like to shake hands with everybody as they get their degrees. And it really has to do with my admiration and love for academia and how important graduations are. So I do enjoy doing them.
And you still teach at Georgetown?
I do. I'm just getting ready now for the semester, and I'm going to have to do it virtually, but I enjoy teaching. And I teach a course, I say, foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox. And David, I don't know if you're going to remember this, but during the Carter administration, as you know, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And the question was, what were we going to do? And we had this crazy interagency meeting, and everybody was suggesting something like cut off their grain or their fishing rights, or let's not send our athletes to the Olympics. And I thought, what kind of a crazy thing is this where we don't know what tools we're going to use? And so I started thinking about what the National Security Toolbox looks like and how the decision-making process works in order to decide which tool is going to be used. And the other part I love about our government is the whole concept of executive legislative relations. So I try to teach about things that I know, and I do enjoy teaching.
Now, you also point out in your book that you've had time as a former Secretary of State to develop a closer relationship with your grandchildren and your 3 daughters, all of whom are adults now. So what has that been like to kind of spend more time with them and to travel the world with them?
Well, I have 3 fantastic daughters, all of whom are very busy doing their thing, and 6 grandchildren. And I try, everything's different now, but I've tried to see them a lot. We have spent vacations together, and I try, one of them lives in, that family lives in San Francisco, so I'm always ready to go there. At the moment, 3 of my grandchildren are college students, so we are talking about how things work now, but they are the ones that give me my optimism and hope. And they're great, because I was giving a talk in San Francisco, and my grandson said, well, I didn't know that Grandma Maddie could be so funny. So I think I've surprised them a little bit. And by the way, my granddaughter from that family said, this was about 8 years ago now, what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. So there are a lot of good things that I learned from my grandchildren who say funny things too.
They don't call you Madam Secretary, they call you
Grandma
Maddie. Well, you have been succeeded by 2 women who've been Secretaries of State. Let's talk about that briefly. Condi Rice, you once tried to recruit her for a Democratic campaign because you knew a little bit about her. And what was the relationship, and what did she tell you?
Well, this is one of these craziest stories in all. My father, as I said, went to Denver. He became a pretty big deal in Denver, and he died in 1977. And there was a funeral with lots of flowers and tributes, and among them was this ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with just some leaves in it. So I said to my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice. She had been a music major, hence the piano, and she had gone to Notre Dame to get her master's, and she was working on her PhD with my father. So this African-American music major from Alabama wrote her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. So in 1987, when I was working for Michael Dukakis, and my job was to find foreign policy advisors for a group. So I thought, why not? I'll call her. A woman, teaches on the West Coast, Soviet expert. So I asked her, and she said, Madeline, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father. So we've talked about that a lot, and we do see each other.
And one of the other women who succeeded you was Hillary Clinton. What was the nature of your relationship with her?
Well, let me go back on something. You had asked about becoming Secretary of State. One of the things that happened when I finally became Secretary of State, and I was traveling with her and President Clinton, and we did this shtick abroad where I would introduce her and she would introduce him. And he said that during this period of great mentioning, that Hillary would go to him and say, why wouldn't you name Madeline? She is most in tune with your interests and expresses them better than anybody else. And besides, it would make your mother happy. So I owe this all to her. But the thing that happened when I was UN ambassador, there were all these jokes always that Hillary was channeling Eleanor Roosevelt. And as you know, Eleanor Roosevelt was very active at the UN. And Hillary would come up, and I would introduce her around to the other ambassadors, and she would stay with me. And we got to be very good friends. One of the things I'm always asked about is life balance. And this is just proof of how difficult it is. As you know, the Beijing Women's Conference happened, and Hillary wanted me to go with her. And I had to leave my youngest daughter's wedding reception to get on a plane to go to the conference where she said women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And I admire her greatly. We did a lot of things together, kind of a tag team. And she was, when I was secretary, one of our really very important ambassadors informally in terms of the way she met with so many people and represented our values.
When you became Secretary of State, it was revealed to your surprise that your parents were born Jewish, your grandparents had been Jewish, and several of them had been killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. And then you wrote about that in your several of your books. But in this book, you reveal something that's new that you went back and saw. I think it's one of your grandmother's diaries that you had never seen before. How did you not know about that diary before, and what did you find in that diary?
Well, let me just go back on something is, when I first became UN ambassador and all of a sudden my name was in the papers all the time. And so one of the things that happened was that I started getting letters from people saying they were relatives and they wanted a visa and it didn't make any sense. And then in 96, I get this letter where the whole story is told to me and I'm just being vetted to be secretary. And so it's a longer story, but I finally did learn the full truth on things. What happened was when my father died, my mother moved to Washington. And then when she died, all her papers were transferred to me, and they were just in my garage and trying to figure out what to do with them. And then that diplomatic security moved in and couldn't, I had to move everything to a storage area. And one day in 2014, I was looking for something in the storage area in one of those public storage areas, and I find this envelope, and inside is this amazing diary. And I didn't know about it at all, but it has been in so many ways like a message in a bottle from a different generation. And it's quite phenomenal. And I did translate it, and it is in the book.
So your papers, all of your papers as Secretary of State, UN Ambassador, and other things, eventually will go to the Library of Congress. Is that right?
Yes, I'm just doing that. I'm very excited about that. And I can't tell you, David, you are so big into history and all the things you've done. I can't quite express what it's like to be even a footnote in American history. And I was at the National Archives, and all of a sudden I see this letter that was President Clinton nominating me to be secretary. And so, and I had done an awful lot of research in the Library of Congress for my dissertation. And so nothing makes me happier than to be able to have my papers at the Library of Congress.
So as we wrap up here, I would just like to ask one or two final questions. One is, the theme of the book festival this year is American ingenuity. And you are an example of a great immigrant who has come in, risen up to the top in the United States. But how would you describe an ingenuity as part of your life? Problem solving, or what would you say is part of your life in terms of ingenuity?
Well, one of the things I was asked to describe myself in 6 words recently. And I said, worried optimist, problem solver, grateful American. And I have always tried to have a positive view about what can be done. And to really try to solve problems. And I am grateful to have been able to come to the United States. And so the combination of all of that, I do think what is remarkable about Americans is the sense of ingenuity and exploration and trying to solve problems. And so, and I have to say, from my teaching experience and spending time with young people and the Wellesley Institute, I really do have faith in the younger generation because we are not going back to status quo ante. We're going to have to use our ingenuity now to solve some of the most complicated problems. And we are problem solvers, a nation of optimists that are problem solvers. And so I'm glad to be able to hopefully see changes that will allow us to solve some of the problems and use our ingenuity and not look backwards.
Now, I forgot to ask you, Hell and Other Destinations, this is your 7th book. Where did the title come from?
Well, the most famous thing I ever said was that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. It was so famous, it ended up on a Starbucks cup. And it came from my own experience where, as I was trying to develop my life, in many ways, I found that there were many women that were judgmental about what I was doing. It was a very different era. And they would say, why are you going to get your degree when you should be at home with your children? Or besides, my hollandaise sauce is better than yours. Or as I traveled around with Geraldine Ferraro as vice presidential candidate, there would be women that would come up to me and say, how can she talk to the Russians. I can't talk to a Russian. And I thought, why is it that women project our own sense of inadequacy on other women? So I thought that we needed to, and I was so often, David, the only woman in the room. And I kind of thought we need more women in the room. And there is a special place in hell for women who don't support each other. And so that's where the statement came from. I hadn't focused, this book was written before the virus. I hadn't focused on the fact of how germane the title is today.
Right. So Madeline, why is history so important? Why is it important that people write books about what they've done? Why do we really need to know about what you did as Secretary of State? Why is history so important to you?
Well, history is incredibly important to me because I have seen what happens when people don't know their history or don't understand the effect of their history and how it shapes people's lives. And so I grew up with a father and mother, but who really talked about the history of the country where I was born, Czechoslovakia, things that had also happened in Europe earlier. And I love history. And when I teach, and I teach this course on the National Security Toolbox, I love to go back and explain the history of what led to the following issues that we're dealing with. And I think you can't function in the world today if you don't understand the history. And so I do think it's incredibly important. And I do think that sometimes it is elaborated on well with personal stories. And so I just have been talking to some of my former students, and they love to hear some of the stories that are part of the history that I was involved in, relationships with various leaders, how you deal with people that have done terrible things, like Milosevic with the Serbs, and how you get your point across. And I do think that the stories also can elaborate. And nobody's better than you in this, in terms of the book that you have put together, in terms of the background stories on American presidents with people that wrote about them. So I do think history and telling it in a way that grabs people's imagination and puts the reader or the listener into understanding what was really taking place at the time in order to understand how issues came about and how they were solved.
So you're going to be giving your pin collection to the State Department Museum, but what does that particular pin that you're wearing now symbolize?
Well, I'll tell you, it's very direct to the last book, because in that book, I do talk about what it was like to be in England during World War II. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. He was working with the government in exile. I spent the Blitz in London as a little girl. And my father broadcast over BBC. And I would listen to BBC, and every broadcast would begin with a kettle drum of the first 5 notes of Beethoven's Fifth, da-da-da-dum, and it's Morse code for V for victory. And so I thought that exactly because of the history aspect of it, that it would be a good pin to wear for this book tour.
Okay, so when will you be writing your next book? This is the 7th. You have another one in mind, and you're going to write one about the next 10 years of your career.
Well, we'll see. I hadn't planned it, but we'll see, because something comes up. I mean, for instance, one of the books that I wrote was about the role of God and religion in foreign policy, because I thought that it was not understood. And so, but as I said, I do have help, and I enjoy helping to put it together. And I do enjoy actually the book tours and talking about things and having an opportunity to learn a lot from the audiences that are able to be a part of it.
Well, Madeline, I enjoyed thoroughly reading the book. Congratulations on getting it done, and congratulations on everything you've done in your career and for our country. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, David, for all you do and for our friendship. Thank you.